picture the scene. It's the World Economic Forum in Davos. And usually this is where you hear these endless, super optimistic speeches about global cooperation.
Right. It's usually very, everyone holding hands.
Exactly. But this year, former Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney steps up to the podium and he drops an absolute bombshell.
He really did.
He flat out declares that the era of mutually beneficial globalization is dead. And, what does that actually mean for you listening right now?
It's a huge shift.
It means the smartphone in your pocket, the car in your driveway, even the price of your monthly energy bill, they are no longer just everyday products. They're now active weapons on the front lines of an entirely new kind of global war.
Yeah, the rules have completely changed.
So today we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating document. It's titled Cómo librar una guerra económica, which translates to How to Wage an Economic War.
Such a cheerful title.
Right. But our mission for this deep dive is to basically extract a brand new operating manual for this unipolar world we're in now.
Yeah.
A world where supply chains, tariffs, and financial infrastructure are the new weapons of mass disruption.
What's fascinating here is the massive shift in perspective that this document actually outlines. I mean, for decades, the U.S. operated almost exclusively on the offensive when it came to economic policy.
Because they could.
Exactly. Because of the sheer size of the American market after the Cold War, Washington rarely had to pay attention to the risk of retaliation. They could just act unilaterally.
Right.
But the text makes it incredibly clear that, well, that unipolar world is gone. Now, here we are in 2026, and the defining characteristic of global economic relations is mutual vulnerability.
Mutual vulnerability.
Yeah. Every nation is caught in this constant search for leverage, but it's paired with this permanent, paralyzing fear of exposure.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because if we are in an economic war, what are the actual weapons? Like, what are we firing at each other? The text spends a lot of time on this concept of puntos de estrangulamiento, or choke points.
Yes, choke points are the core of this whole theory.
But I actually want to push back on this idea for a second, because when I hear choke point, I just think of like a vulnerability, a temporary traffic jam, or maybe just being reliant on importing something.
That's how most people think of it, yeah.
Right. And isn't it true that if the U.S. is the biggest consumer market in the world, doesn't that make us the ones in control? I mean, if we threaten to close our borders and stop buying, don't the exporting countries just go completely broke?
You would think so, and that's actually a really common misconception that the text addresses head on. The document is super precise about this because people often confuse a simple reliance on imports with a true strategic choke point.
So what's the difference then?
Well, the source outlines 3 very specific, rigid rules that define a real choke point. First, you need massive market concentration.
Like a monopoly.
Exactly. We're talking near monopoly levels by a single country or a really tightly knit coalition. Second, there can be absolutely zero short-term substitutes.
Meaning you can't just call up another country and buy it from them.
Right. You can't just pivot. And third, you must have the ability to inflict massive asymmetric harm on your target with minimal damage to your own economy.
Asymmetric harm. Okay, let's test that against a real-world example the document brings up, which is N95 medical masks back in 2020.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right, because at the start of the pandemic, the U.S. imported, about 3/4 of its masks from China. And when China restricted exports, there was a massive panic.
Empty shelves everywhere.
Yeah, empty shelves. It felt like a massive choke point at the time. But the text argues it actually wasn't, right?
Exactly. It wasn't a true choke point.
Because making a mask is essentially just pressing synthetic fibers together. It's cheap. And within a year, U.S. factories had quadrupled their production. So that was a traffic jam, not a choke point.
Precisely. A true choke point is not a traffic jam. It is owning the only bridge in the world, holding the patent on the concrete used to build it, and having the power to decide who gets to cross.
Wow. That's a great way to put it.
And if you look at the real choke points the text identifies, they are staggering. For example, the U.S. dollar is used in almost 90% of all foreign exchange transactions.
90%?
Yeah. The financial infrastructure to replace that simply doesn't exist overnight. Then you have U.S. advanced semiconductors. Just one company, NVIDIA, controls about 85% of the market for artificial intelligence chips.
That's wild. And what about the other side?
On the flip side, you have China's refining of rare earth elements, where they control roughly 90% of the global market.
So that 90% number seems to really be the magic threshold here. And the document points out that this is exactly why broad, generalized tariffs often fail to actually coerce other nations.
Oh, absolutely.
Like when former President Donald Trump announced those broad global tariffs, the theory was that countries would just bend to his will because the U.S. is the world's largest market.
Right, the idea that the buyer has all the power.
Exactly. But the text does the math. The U.S. only represents about 13% of global imports. So when the U.S. slapped tariffs on countries like Brazil and China, they didn't surrender.
No, they didn't.
They just rerouted their exports to other markets and actually set export records. I guess 13% of the market is an inconvenience, but 90% is a weapon.
That's exactly it. And that leads directly to how these weapons actually function.
Yeah.
Because the true power of a choke point is the asymmetry of the damage it causes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the text gives this terrifying mathematical breakdown of a rare earth element called neodymium.
Yeah, the neodymium example is really sobering.
China makes roughly $3.4 billion exporting rare earth elements and magnets. And honestly, in the grand scheme of global trade, $3.4 billion sounds like a rounding error.
It's tiny.
Right. But the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that if China were to cut the U.S. supply of neodymium by just 30%, it would slash U.S. GDP by 2.2%.
Which is astronomical.
Let's break down why that happens. Because it's not just a matter of, oh, we have fewer magnets for refrigerators.
No, not at all. Neodymium is the critical component in electric vehicle motors, the actuators in fighter jets, the generators in wind turbines.
So it's in everything important.
Everything. If you cut the supply by 30%, entire multi-billion-dollar assembly lines in Detroit or at major defense contractors just grind to an absolute halt.
Wow.
And when the factory stops, workers are furloughed. When workers are furloughed, consumer spending drops. The supply chain cascades into a massive, broader economic freeze.
That is staggering. So a 2.2% hit to U.S. GDP translates to a loss of about $600 billion.
Yeah.
We are talking about a mechanism where China sacrifices maybe $1 billion in their own export revenue to instantly vaporize $600 billion of American economic output.
That incredibly disproportionate ratio, that's exactly what gives export controls their devastating coercive power. It is the ultimate low-risk, high-reward weapon for whoever holds the monopoly.
But wait, if we know we are this vulnerable, why don't we just build our own rare earth refinement facilities? I mean, we have the capital, we definitely have the technology.
We do, but the text outlines what it calls the timeline trap. You know, you can't just spin up a rare earth refinement facility like you can a medical mast factory.
It takes more time.
Way more time. These projects require highly specialized chemical processing, massive environmental permitting, specialized engineering.
So how long does it take?
Well, the source notes that even the most optimistic projections, like the ones from U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, suggest it would take at least 2 years to build rare earth independence.
Okay, 2 years is a long time in a trade war.
But that's the optimistic view. Historically, a typical rare earth extraction and refinement project takes 9 years to reach actual production.
9 years. That means for nearly a decade, the U.S. is completely exposed to a $600 billion threat just hanging over its head.
Exactly.
That gap in time is just pure leverage for whoever controls the supply.
Which forces us to ask a really fundamental question about strategy. Because, yes, the U.S. possesses its own massive economic weapons, like the dollar and AI chips.
Right.
But what exactly are policymakers trying to achieve when they pull the trigger on these things? The text categorizes the goals of economic warfare into 3 distinct and honestly often conflicting buckets.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm getting this. So the first goal is stigmatization, right? Or public shaming.
Yes, stigmatization.
You sanction a corrupt dictator or a human rights violator basically just to show moral disapproval. But the text seems pretty critical of this, noting that it often just pushes developing nations away from the U.S. and causes humanitarian harm without actually changing the target's behavior.
Yeah, it's generally seen as the weakest use of the tool. The second goal is much more strategic, which is weakening the adversary.
Like a war of attrition.
Think of it exactly like a war of attrition. A prime example given in the document is the U.S. export controls on advanced microchips destined for China.
Yeah.
As Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor, noted, the goal there isn't to force China to change a specific diplomatic policy. The goal is strictly to maintain the largest possible U.S. lead in artificial intelligence by permanently capping China's computational power.
Okay. And then the third goal is coercion.
Yes.
This is when you use economic pressure as a direct threat to force another country to change its immediate behavior, like the Biden administration warning Russia of severe financial consequences before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, aiming to deter them.
Right.
Or the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran to try and force them to the negotiating table over their nuclear program.
But here is where the strategy often completely falls apart. The text brilliantly points out that policymakers rarely articulate which of these three goals they are actually pursuing.
And if you mix them up, it doesn't work.
If you confuse them, you end up sabotaging your own leverage entirely.
Okay, this brings up the Taiwan paradox mentioned in the text. And honestly, I really struggled with this at first, but it is such a profound contradiction once you wrap your head around it.
It really is.
Let's walk through the logic. If the U.S. wants to use economic war to deter China from invading Taiwan, the absolute smartest strategy is to make China incredibly dependent on U.S. technology.
Right. You want them completely hooked.
Exactly. So the threat of suddenly cutting them off is terrifying enough to stop an invasion before it starts.
Correct. That is coercion through deterrent.
Right. But if your goal is to weaken China's military capabilities right now, you should cut off their access to that advanced technology immediately so they can't build better weapons.
Yes.
The paradox is the moment you cut them off to weaken them, you completely lose your leverage to deter them. I mean, you can't hold a weapon to someone's head if you've already fired the bullet.
Exactly. If you pull the trigger too early in the name of weakening them, the threat is gone. The adversary simply absorbs the pain, adapts, and moves on. Which is a perfect segue into a really crucial dynamic the text explores, the sheer overuse of these economic weapons.
And real quick, it's worth noting for you listening how objectively the text looks at recent U.S. policy here. We are just reporting what's in the source, regardless of political sides. And it points out that no matter who is in the Oval Office, there is a bipartisan addiction to economic sanctions in Washington.
Yeah, it's a structural addiction at this point.
The tool's being used so frequently that it's literally degrading the power of the tool itself.
The source provides some staggering context for this. It notes that during his 2024 campaign, Donald Trump actually stated he hoped to use sanctions as little as possible.
Right.
But in reality, the pace of sanctions has roughly doubled compared to his predecessors, and the targets have become incredibly broad.
The list in the text is just wild. Just in the last year, the U.S. has sanctioned Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, Colombian President Gustavo Petro, judges from the International Criminal Court, and even threatened to cut off trade with Spain over U.S. military base access during the conflict with Iran.
Everywhere.
We are just throwing these financial bombs everywhere.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the consequence of this reckless abandonment is a massive global blowback effect. Because the U.S. is firing its economic weapons so frequently and sometimes so unpredictably against allies and adversaries alike, the rest of the world has realized they are living in the collateral damage radius.
So they're getting out of the blast zone.
Exactly. So they are building their own armor.
Let's talk about what that armor actually looks like mechanically. The text details how, after the U.S. sanctioned Russia over Crimea back in 2014, China learned a very clear lesson about the power of the U.S. dollar.
They absolutely did.
So they started building CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. They now have about 1,700 participating institutions globally, and they are advancing the ECNY, their digital currency. So how exactly does that bypass the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. enforces sanctions primarily through the SWIFT messaging system and correspondent banks that clear dollar transactions. If you use dollars, eventually that transaction touches a U.S.-regulated entity.
And then the U.S. can just block it.
Right. But the ECNY and CIPS are designed to settle transactions on a completely separate ledger, directly between central banks or participating institutions.
Oh, wow.
It physically removes the U.S. banking system from the loop, meaning U.S. Treasury sanctions literally have no mechanical way to intercept or block the transaction.
So they are basically building a parallel financial universe.
Yes, exactly.
And the document points out it's not just adversaries doing this, it's allies too. Europe is terrified of being caught in the crossfire. U.S. tech giants like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle control 70% of the global cloud services market.
That's a massive choke point.
European governments are deeply worried that Washington might weaponize that dominance. Like, what if they demand access to European data or just shut off servers during a diplomatic dispute?
To counter that, Europe is actively funding what they call sovereign clouds and pushing for a digital euro. Think of it like a city realizing it gets all its electricity from a neighboring town that keeps threatening to cut the power.
Right.
Europe is spending billions to build its own independent power grid so that if Washington ever flips the switch, Europe's digital lights stay on.
Which brings us to the inevitable climax of all this tension. What happens when the independent power grids are built, the parallel financial systems are running, and two fully armed economic superpowers actually collide head-on?
The text gives us the perfect, chaotic, real-world test case from just last year, April 2025.
Right. China finally decided to test its monopoly and slapped strict export controls on rare earths in direct retaliation against generalized U.S. tariffs. And the result was immediate chaos. Supply chains started collapsing within weeks. Ford actually had to temporarily shut down a factory producing the Explorer SUV because they physically ran out of the rare earth magnets needed for the motors.
Yeah, the assembly line just stopped.
And Raytheon was frantically scrambling to find alternative sources for the minerals they need just to build Tomahawk cruise missiles.
It was a brutal textbook demonstration of asymmetric power. But what's fascinating here is how quickly the conflict was actually resolved.
Very quickly.
The text notes that within weeks, the U.S. administration rushed to the negotiating table, agreeing to reduce tariffs in exchange for China lifting the rare earth restrictions. It was such a stark shift in the power dynamic that it led Trump to start referring to the U.S. and China as the G2, acknowledging an almost parity in economic destructive capability.
But wait, I have to ask, why did the U.S. blink so fast? I mean, the U.S. still controls the dollar. We still control the AI chips. If both sides have these massive weapons, why was Washington the first to back down and negotiate?
Because of a fundamental structural vulnerability in the United States that the text calls the willpower gap.
A willpower gap.
Yeah. The U.S. public has a remarkably low tolerance for economic pain. Citizens in a democracy are often willing to endure sacrifice for a traditional military conflict if they believe the cause is just.
Sure.
But in economic war, the public simply won't accept soaring inflation, massive factory closures, or exorbitant gas prices just to win a trade dispute.
Because they just vote out whoever is in power.
Exactly. Voters vote with their wallets at the pump, which forces politicians to abandon long-term strategic goals for short-term political survival.
And the source highlights a stunning example of this exact dynamic. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, which is like the most critical geographic choke point for global energy, oil prices obviously skyrocketed.
Right.
To combat this and keep gas prices down for American consumers, the U.S. administration actually provided relief on sanctions against Russian oil. Let me make sure I'm hearing this right. The U.S. actively relieved financial pressure on a geopolitical adversary during a global crisis, simply to ensure that Americans didn't punish the incumbent party over high prices at the pump.
That is the willpower gap in action. An authoritarian regime doesn't face competitive elections. They can force their population to absorb massive economic suffering to achieve a long-term strategic goal.
But a democracy cannot.
Right. The voters will simply punish the politicians in power, meaning the Democratic leader always has a shorter runway in an economic war.
So if the U.S. can't win a war of economic attrition because of this willpower gap, and trying to be entirely self-sufficient takes a decade and trillions of dollars, what is the actual path forward? Are we just doomed to this chaotic fragmentation where every country builds its own inefficient, isolated supply chains?
Well, the text concludes that total self-sufficiency is a dangerous, prohibitively expensive illusion. Instead, the solution lies in coordinated friendshoring.
Friendshoring.
Yes. The text points to a really promising initiative. The critical mineral-free trade zone proposed by the Trump administration with the EU, Japan, and other allies. The mechanism here isn't just about trading, it's about establishing minimum prices across allied nations.
Oh, interesting.
It's about coordinating joint financing for new mining operations and legally guaranteeing stable supply chains among friendly nations.
So it's about building a fortress with your friends, pooling your capital and your resources, rather than trying to build a fortress entirely alone.
Exactly.
And the text explicitly warns that without this kind of structural coordination, allies risk falling into a toxic cycle of buy American versus buy European subsidy wars.
Yeah, which helps no one.
Right. If we just fight over who subsidizes their own industries more, we ultimately hurt everyone and weaken the collective defense against rival nations.
Precisely. The text argues that moving forward, the U.S. must deploy its economic power in a much more disciplined, coordinated manner to mold a new order, rather than just indiscriminately breaking the old one.
We've covered incredible ground today. We started with Mark Carney declaring the death of mutually beneficial globalization in Davos.
Feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, really does. And we explored the terrifying math of choke points, where, just a 30% reduction in a single mineral cascades into a $600 billion hit to GDP.
Astonishing numbers.
We saw the undeniable blowback of treating the global financial system like a weapon, pushing friends and foes alike to build parallel systems to basically bypass the dollar.
Right.
And we saw firsthand in the G2 clash of April 2025 just how incredibly fragile our daily lives are when these superpowers collide and democratic willpower is tested.
It really underscores the ultimate reality of our era, which is that economic security and traditional national security are no longer separate domains. They are entirely permanently intertwined.
And it reminds you that this hidden war isn't happening in the shadows of some boardroom somewhere. It's happening at your local gas station, in your local car dealership, and inside the technology you rely on every single day. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought inspired by the text.
Okay, let's hear it.
So the source warns against the chaotic economic fragmentation of the 1930s, calling instead for a new, structured global agreement, a new Bretton Woods. But it leaves us with this wild idea to ponder on your own. During the Cold War, traditional military peace was maintained by the concept of mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons, right?
MAD.
What if the creation of massive, equally powerful, coordinated economic blocs doesn't lead to a global trade war? What if it actually creates a new kind of economic, mutually assured destruction?
Wow.
Could the ultimate terrifying weaponization of global trade actually be the very thing that forces world peace, simply because the cost of pulling the trigger becomes too devastating for anyone's economy to survive?
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
Think about it. Are we building the only bridge in the world just to ensure no one ever dares to blow it up? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.